The good news of the gospel is only really good to us when we heard the bad news. And today we're talking about the bad news, sin. So on the one hand, we have a lot of progressive Christians today who view humanity as basically good. And really, on the other hand, a lot of Bible-believing Christians also tend to think, sin is kind of a rare exception in my life. So what has God revealed to us in the Bible about what sin is and its consequences?
Sin is, of course, what separates us from God. That is going to be in that realm of sin. And so that is the bad news. And also, I don't know, this isn't good news, but humanity has had a very hard time being faithful. So this struggle, this is not something that we alone struggle with. And I know when I'm talking with my students, one of the things that I always tell them is we all struggle. And if we're at that point where we think, okay, well, I'm the only one that has this problem, we're actually weaker. God has given us this beautiful gift of the church. He's given us this beautiful gift of salvation. And he has worked with his people to try to create an avenue to try to heal this rift, ever since he was working with the Jews. And so sin, it is something that is very, like you said, this is like the bad news. But the good news is that God loves us and he's wanting to reach out and to do that. So one of the things that I sometimes ask my classes, or sometimes ask a crowd, is who is without sin? Because I feel like a lot of times we walk around and we act like it's not a big deal. We act like, okay, well, I'm a good person and I don't really have any major issues. So we kind of act like we don't have sin. But when I ask that question in front of those crowds, nobody ever raises their hand. I've never had anybody raise their hand and say that they're perfect. And, in 1 John, we read that if we say we're without sin, well, we're deceiving ourselves. We all have sin. Romans 3:23, we have all fallen short. The only perfect person was Jesus. And we spend our entire lives trying to become like him, trying to be as Jesus-like as we can, but we're never going to be perfect. We're always going to mess up, and we're always going to need God's grace. So sin is the bad news, but it's the good news, because that's exactly what God is trying to save us from.
And when the Bible talks about sin, it often uses the phrase, walking according to the flesh. And
oh, yeah.
Kind of like doing what comes naturally. And so,
right.
Should we feel bad for doing what comes naturally, or should we just stay as far away from our fleshly desires as possible? How does that work in a faithful life?
Right. Well, walking by the flesh, that phrase, that's definitely something that I point out when we come across it in the classroom, because it's when we're trying to do things our own way, using our own wisdom and our own logic, that we get into trouble. You can see that in the Old Testament when the Israelite kings, when it's their own political prowess or whatever to try to take care of Israel, and they didn't seek God and they didn't seek his direction. That's when they got into trouble. Take a look at Adam and Eve. What were they doing in the garden? That's where sin's first entering into the world. Well, they were trying to have knowledge. They were trying to do things their own way with that knowledge. And that's really, that's where we start to get ourselves into trouble. And I feel like it's important to bring that up, because a lot of times when we're talking about living by the flesh, we're thinking about stuff that's we're doing what we want to do. So this sounds good to me at the time, or we're justifying things. Well, that's not a big deal if I get involved with that. Everybody's doing it. And as junior high as that sounds, are adults really that different? We also make those same types of justifications. We need to consider how, when we're trying to do things our own way, then that is also a big area where we can get in trouble.
And then the Bible talks about, walking in the Spirit as kind of the opposite, or the antidote to, walking the flesh. And what does that look like in relation to our natural urges? Is it just a completely foreign, almost impossible concept to try to walk in the Spirit, or is that something that is actually doable?
Yeah, well, think of David. I mean, David, even though he is a very respected king, he walked in the flesh at different moments in his life. But he was called somebody who tried to seek God's heart. He tried to follow God's will. And I feel like if we're doing that, if we can focus ourselves on what is the will of God in this situation, in my life, and just keep that in mind, be prayerful, like look for direction and try to like review how we're living, what we're doing. Is this activity? Is this attitude? Is this something that needs to be in my life? Then that's going to help us walk by the Spirit.
That makes me think about conversations I've had through the years with people who are struggling with really difficult sin. I have a friend when we lived in North Carolina who was struggling with homosexuality, and he finally decided, I'm going to act on that. I've tried to live this other way for my adult life, and now I'm just going to marry this guy. We're going to do it. And he said to me, Renee, I've never felt happier. It's not this feels the easiest and the best. Mm-hmm. Like my whole 20s and early 30s have been a struggle. And that really struck me, that like none of us is immune. I am not immune to the flesh feels right. Mm-hmm. In some ways, a lot of times. Do you see that with your students?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, when we're doing what we want to do and we're doing something how we want to do it, then of course, I mean, that feels good. That feels easy. But even when we're like making a decision, let's even take this out of the spiritual realm. We know we need to do something. And the little pep talks I give my students, yes, you need to get out of bed. Yes, it feels fantastic to be in bed all day, but that's not what you need. You need to get started on your paper. That will actually, you'll feel better in the end. But right now at the beginning, maybe a little hard. So yeah, when we're just kind of floating along, that's always easier. But yeah.
Yeah, I think of like I don't want to take us too far afield because Daniel knows this isn't on the list of questions, but I'm thinking
we're going off script.
our feelings were given to us by God to indicate, important information, and yet we can be deceived, and sometimes they give us wrong information, and that's where like the Spirit comes in, the Word comes in, and it's like, whoa, no, this feels right, but it doesn't, and then eventually it does feel right, is the beautiful thing. In sanctification, it does feel right.
Yeah.
All right.
So that's one of the things, let me kind of comment on that too. And I'm glad that you brought that up, that it does feel right later. Because when we're walking with God, when we're actively growing in Him, when we're discovering and using our spiritual gifts, we're actually acting in a way and living out those gifts in a way that God created us to do. And that absolutely feels right. One of the things that I try to help the girls that I work with discover is their spiritual gifting, so that they know how to serve in the church, so they know, what God has given them. And when we have that feeling, when we're trying to grow and we're doing something and it feels right, that's a pretty good indicator that we're on the right path with spiritual gift discovery, which is a topic, but I think it relates.
Yeah, because it is part of walking in the Spirit versus walking in the flesh. Such good news. All right, so that's one aspect of sin. Then we see, I think it's like Ephesians 2, Paul says, you were dead in the trespasses of your sin in which you once walked, following the course of the world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. So let's talk about the world. Yeah. What is God telling us when He talks about sin in terms of the world?
Yeah. Well, John really loves that term. And one of the beautiful things that he does is, especially in the Gospel of John, he uses it as a dichotomy. So you have the world, and then you've got that versus how we're supposed to be living. So let's just talk about that word just for a second. So in one of the classes that I teach is Gospel of John. So I spend quite a bit of time talking about this particular idea, but it could be like the earth, like the creation of God. It could be humanity, or it could be the evil satanic system that's controlling our world. And so that's the one that I think we should focus on here. But when I know, when going back to the Gospel of John here, when it's written, I feel like there are so many parallels with where we are today, because he was trying to encourage the Christians who said that they believed, but to varying levels. So these are Jewish Christians, probably to varying levels, were open with their faith. So some had been open with their faith, had been pushed out of the synagogues, had paid that price of losing family, friends, jobs, everything for their faith. And then some who were like, I don't know. I don't know if I want to share my faith. There's too much at stake. And he's trying to encourage both ends. So on the one end, people that had lost it all, you made the right choice. On the other end, people who weren't sure how open they wanted to be, he was trying to encourage them to step out. This is the right choice. And so this idea of, the world, this satanic system, well, I think we can really identify with what that feels like, what that looks like. And we're tempted to not stand up to sin. We're tempted to, justify something, to be controlled by that. But he's saying, you've got to have the struggle to figure out how to be in this world where we're a part of this system that's run by Satan, not run by God. And then figure out how to interact, to minister. How are we in the world, but not of the world? And just John's writings are beautiful for this particular topic. So
I was on CNN the other day. I was reading CNN, and they had an article that caught my eye, and it was something about like, what are your guiltiest sins? And so I clicked on it, and it was like, it's eating this kind of food, and it's eating this kind of food, and eating a little different of a take on the word sin than what we're used to in Christian circles. Culturally, it would seem like the greatest sins nowadays might be things like, not taking care of the earth as well as we should, maybe not recycling like we should. A lot of systemic types of sin, not working for justice initiatives, that sort of thing. And obviously these are important things, but the Bible really emphasizes the inner life. Culturally, it seems like we've moved past that, and we kind of see sin as, at least the sins that really matter, as being very outward, very systemic type things. So, could you kind of explain how or why we should see the internal life as important when we're talking about sin?
Yeah, well, and let me talk about this a little bit from an evangelistic perspective too. And so one of the things that I think is really important is that we look at what our society is concerned about. So in this particular case, you brought up two topics. So we've got basically environmentalism, and we have justice issues. And so let's talk about environmentalism. If we did a poll at church, if we said, hey, are we supposed to take care of the earth? As a kid, anyway, I was a little bit concerned or wondered how we might vote on that. Are people going to say, oh, no, absolutely not? Because there was almost a worshiping of the earth type movement that was going on when I was younger. But I feel like our churches would say, yeah, we should take care of our environment. We should take care of the world. So we have something in common. So we can look back at the stewardship that was given to Adam, and then we can look at what their concerns are, and we have a little bit of common ground. And so I feel like this is kind of an interesting point, because it can help inform us a bit. How can we create conversations with people? So, and there's obviously some very fine lines. It shouldn't be all about those things. But did Jesus care, about justice? Well, sure, he treated everybody the same. Did God care about people who were being mistreated, the orphan, the widow? Absolutely. They were very close to his heart. So we do have something to say about those. And I feel like finding that common ground is a good place to start, but that's not the end all. We have to look at sin and look at what God wants from us on definitely a broader scale too.
I think, like, at least for myself, to be prepared to have that kind of conversation, I need to think it through ahead of time.
Yeah.
And to be wise in.
I have to think stuff through ahead of time too. So
yeah, to be wise and go, hey, that's a great, like, we have this in common. And my motivation might be just a little bit different than yours. Let me tell you, let me tell you why. That's great. It's a good thought. Yeah. Well, okay, a little bit more about the world here. I think we probably people have always been tempted to conform to the world culture around them. But because America was kind of culturally Christian for a long time, we kind of didn't really, I don't think I did. I'm a child of the 70s. I didn't feel like I was swimming against the current of culture in the 80s or 90s. I didn't really feel it. And so I'm feeling it now. Like, I pause before I say things or maybe post something for the public to see or read. So there's definitely pressure for us to conform. Can you give us some helpful hints?
Yeah.
How can we not do that? And how can we, how can we do better, but not be that finger wagging kind of angry person?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it's kind of like we've been a frog in a pot. So that water has been heating up slowly, and then suddenly we realize, oh, this isn't the place where we thought we were. And it is interesting because I know right before I started my doctorate, and one of the reasons I actually chose to go to Fuller is because I was struggling with how do I help my students be able to figure out how to interact with the world? How do I give them hope? How do I give them tools to do that? When we think that we're in an environment that is mostly Christian, we don't have to think twice before we post something. We don't have to think twice before we say something. And it really, that's easier, going back to the word easy again, but it's almost a little bit of a disservice because we don't have to make a firm decision. We can just float along and we can do that. And so I think that that's positive. I think we can view that in a positive light, even though it's more difficult in certain situations, because we do have to be intentional. One of the things that's been a really big problem over, probably since well before I was ever on this earth, and that's the idea of arm's length Christianity, where we're like, okay, well, we're actually pretty good because they're doing that over there, but I'm not. And then what they do moves, and then we find ourselves moving. So we've actually connected ourselves to culture. Everybody has a desire to fit in. And so we just don't want to be too weird. We may not want to do that thing. We may understand that that's wrong, but at the same time, we're not doing it, like they're doing it. I know for my husband and I, when we would come back on furloughs, it was pretty shocking to see how something like media had changed in just a couple of years. So something that wouldn't have been acceptable 2 years later, they were doing more of that. And it's just interesting to see that cultural shift, because you wouldn't think that there would be that much change in just a couple of years, So, but yeah, arm's length Christianity, not taking stances. Of course, there's a big push not to be judgmental, which is not good to be judgmental from an evangelistic perspective, because we do need to find that common ground. But at the same time, we have to be able to make a judgment that this is right or this is wrong. This fits with the Bible. This fits with Christianity, or it doesn't. And so I try to help my students hear the difference between those two words.
Community is going to be super important. It always has been, but I think, once you are weird, once you're like, I can't do that. I can't, as Rod Dreher says, in his book, Live Not by Lies, I can at least not agree with the lie. I can at least not speak something that's not true. Once you do that, you're going to need community more than ever. Those are your people, because you're not going to have anybody else.
Yeah. And that's exactly what's been hit with the pandemic. I hear so many people talking about the lack of community. I really feel like churches right now need to be focusing on creating community. And just one example of something I'm involved with this week, our women's ministry at College Church, we decided just to do some fun things just to try to get people together. So we're having like a paint afternoon. So we're having a painting event. Well, we had 3 times the number of people sign up that we had anticipated because people are desiring community and they've missed that. So I do feel like we can, have something to offer in that area.
So let me give you a quote by Richard Dawkins, and famous atheist. And sometimes what he says is a little out of step with culture. Here's something that he says that I think our culture is right there. He's talking about Augustine and Augustine's disappointment in himself that he enjoyed stealing, with the pear incident. And then Dawkins says this, he says, Christian focus is overwhelmingly on sin, 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 sin. What a nasty little preoccupation to have dominating your life. On the one hand, I don't want my kids just being dominated by, oh, have I sinned? Was that a sin? Oh my goodness, but on the other hand, is what we're doing here a nasty little preoccupation? Are we accomplishing anything by talking about sin and talking about how sin's a big deal?
Yeah. Well, sin's a part of everybody's life. It's everybody's struggle. So I do think that we need to think about that. Is there absolute right or wrong? In my anthropology class, that's one of the things that we do talk about, because the world or people who aren't adhering to Christian beliefs would say, no, there isn't. In fact, whatever is accepted by the culture at large is fine. And I think most people, Christian or non-Christian, would draw some lines to some of those things. For example, like genocide. That's most people in the world would say, that is not right. You've got to do something. So, but because there is a push to not recognize that there is a right and wrong, I think as Christians, we have to have this conversation. If we want to raise our kids, if we want them to really seek God and seek holiness and seek to walk by the Spirit, then we have to talk about it.
Yeah, I was like, no, it's not irrelevant. But I do see his point though, because I view everything through the lens of raising children, because that's what I've done for 20 years. And I'm thinking back to when you're training a kid under 5, you've got these really narrow boundaries for them, which you expand as they grow and mature and can handle more freedom. But if every kid tries lying, right? Like it's a developmental stage of brain, the development of the brain. They realize oh, wait a second, my reality right now, my parents don't actually know this. I can deceive them and all this. Well, I panicked, when my first child started lying. I'm like, no. So a very wise person said, okay, you don't want to allow lying, but you want to lift up the virtue that you're looking for. You want to be pointing out every time she's telling the truth and set her up for easy ways to tell the truth. When you know the answer to the question, did you pick up your toys? Because you've already seen that she did. Then you ask her and then you say, yes, that's right. And you tell the truth, and we love to tell the truth. So yeah, I think Richard Dawkins is onto something there. We've got to know where the boundary lines are, but we don't want to just focus on the no.
Yeah.
It's because obedience is freedom. It's in the end, it's freedom. So yeah.
And that goes back to the whole walking by the flesh versus walking by the Spirit. So if we're focusing solely on sins, saying sin, like was mentioned, then we're focusing definitely on the negative, where we need to be focusing not on doing the right thing or the wrong thing, but what's the heart thing? What is going on? What is motivating us? What is driving us? And yeah, I definitely think there needs to be a correction there. And he does like to write about sin. So.
And you mentioned genocide and how everybody would agree that, yeah, genocide is bad. How much genocide, though, goes back to the 10th of the 10 commandments, which a lot of people think is just no big deal, but envy, covetousness.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's an inner sin. That, man, it wreaks a lot of havoc. Speaking of another, what some people would call a nasty little preoccupation, the devil.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how does God depict the devil, demons? How should we feel about the devil, demons, especially in the context of talking about sin here and the destructive nature of sin? How does the reality of the devil and demons, how does that factor in?
Yeah, well, there is a spiritual battle going on, and we can see that reading through the Bible. We can see from the very beginning, from the garden, that there was this spiritual battle. So I think, we talk about the devil. I don't know, maybe is it because we turned him into a cartoon? But it's almost like we're talking about the tooth fairy sometimes when we're talking about somebody. It's just this little thing. It's not real. He's not real. But there is a spiritual battle. And what does he want? He wants to destroy, and that's something that I really talk with my students about. He wants to destroy you. Don't think you can flirt with something. His ultimate goal is to destroy your life and destroy your faith. He's prowling around like a lion, as 1 Peter 5 mentions, and he's tricky, and you think about the divisions in our churches. I mean, that's got to be heartbreaking. One of the things that breaks my heart is to read Jesus's final prayers before he was arrested, because he talked about how he wanted unity among his believers. And how are people going to know that we're Christians? By our love, and we will fight about just about anything. I've got something in my pocket that's been actually pretty cantankerous, even in churches over the past year. And like, why are we fighting about a little piece of, of cloth? I mean, we just get all bent out of shape, and that's Satan. He will distract. He will use politics if that can create division. He will use apathy if that will keep us from doing something. He'll use excuses. He'll use self-centeredness. He'll use anything.
So I'm thinking, okay, your bachelor's is in psychology. So it's kind of a psychology kind of a question. So he's the father of lies. That's what Jesus says. He's the father of lies. So when we are telling ourselves something that's not true, that's Satan also whispering. I mean, I know he tells lies through the culture. Every culture gets some things right and some things wrong, but personally,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think that thinking of psychology terms, so something like negative self-talk, and kind of going back to something I've mentioned previously. So, like, if we think we're the only person that is having this struggle, if he can separate us out, that creates weakness. And that negative self-talk, where we're, it could be anything really, but where we're talking against ourselves, either from a spiritual aspect or even just from like a physical aspect or a friendship aspect or academic aspect. I mean, all of those things. He can use all of that to try to make us weaker. And, when that happens, he actually has us in a very good place for him to be highly effective. So one of the most difficult things to do, I think, is to really try to see ourselves with the eyes that God sees us. I mean, that's something that we've really got to think about. So how does God see me? Does he see me as a sinner? Oh, that worthless, piece of junk over there. She can't do anything right. Or does he see me as his child? And when he sees me as his child, sin, we've got to try to avoid that. We've got to try to understand that. We have to try to walk by the Spirit. But at the same time, we have to accept God's grace. And I thought for a long time, I kind of deceived myself a bit, if you will, that I was humble. Okay, so I'm humble and I'm not going to think that I'm a good person or easy to forgive. And I'm sure there's many other people that have been in that position. But when we accept God's grace, I mean, that's actually, humility. Not accepting it is actually maybe closer to pride. So, but really accepting that, understanding we are a new creation in him. I think that's important. That's an important point.
Great point. I mean, I've heard that said before. Tim Keller was said when his first little church, he had a woman who she had this terrible self-talk, terrible self-esteem. I can never be forgiven for the things I've done. And he said, it's actually a form of spiritual pride, as if Christ's blood doesn't cover your sins. It covers everybody else's, but you're focusing on yourself too much. Like you said, not focusing on how God sees you, his perspective.
It's incredibly common. Yeah. It really is. Yeah.
Well, okay. So we've talked about the strategies of the devil. It's a problem if we don't believe he exists. But how can we keep that balance that you're just talking about? How can we have a positive self-image, but still be realistic about our sin and know that we're in progress here?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that we also need to realize is what God's agenda is with us. I mean, he wants us to rest. He wants us to be comfortable in him. He wants us to feel cared for. You know, he's the perfect parent. But his ultimate agenda isn't that we have a positive self-image, it's that we're saved, you know? And so I think realizing that is also part of that balance. So if we understand that he wants us saved, well, one of the things that I think about is that he will not stop pursuing us until he knows that we're at that point. You know, if we're doing something, if we're deceiving ourselves and we're like, oh, you know, that's fine. It's okay if I dabble in this, or it's okay if I'm involved in this activity, even though I'm not sure that it's actually okay, you know, by God's standards. Then he will pursue us and try to get us away from that. And we can hit some bumps in the road. I mean, he's a good parent. He's not opposed to putting in a little, you know, a little something to get our attention. So, yeah, just that balance, I think, just kind of recognizing and really thinking about that and just trying to realize what his agenda is for us versus, you know, I even think like the term positive self-image, I mean, that's coming from secular sources, really. So yeah, God wants us to feel comfortable and feel good, but that's not the agenda.
Yeah, that you're right. It's not the agenda. And I kind of hate that language, but I wrote the question, so it's my fault.
But it's a good point. There was one person that I heard about, a professor at a different university, that really wasn't certain if he could accept like God's grace. Like he wasn't sure, and he was an incredible person, but he was talking to his class and he said, I just don't know if I'm saved. I don't know if I'm in, you know, and we're also talking about predestination a little bit here too. But I think God does want us to really lean into that, because that does affect like how we're thinking, how we're feeling, affects how we're going to interact with people, and it affects our ministry, and it affects our ability to reach out. So it is important.
In the end, the positive self-image is really just a knowledge of the truth of like who you are in Christ.
Right. Yes.
I mean, like not just in your brain, but like in every fiber of your being.
Yeah.
And as you continue to set aside sin, like, you know, you can test yourself and go, oh yeah, I'm not that person I was. I'm not as far as I want to be. But look where I've come. And it's not prideful, it's encouraging.
Yeah. And there's actually some things that we can do to help us along this path from kind of a spiritual development standpoint. So one of the things that is kind of the powerhouse of change would be a prayer of reflection at the end of the day. Like, so every night before we go to bed, think back through our day and think, okay, so is there something I could have done differently? Did I handle the situations that I was in correctly? Do I need to make changes? And then just pray about those and really bring those, you know, before God. So being aware, being reflective, that's definitely going to help. So.
Oh, that is great advice. So not watching Netflix and falling asleep is not as good.
You can watch Netflix before as long as it's, a good show. So, and then you can do your prayer of reflection afterwards.
So I just love practical little nuggets of advice. That's so practical. Like we can all go home and do that. And God is gentle. In my history, when I've asked God to show me where he needs to work on, he doesn't lay the whole book out of my life and go, here's everything you got to work on. You're a mess. He peels back the layers of the onion gently and kindly, but he doesn't leave it where they are.
And another prayer that I think is also important to pray is to pray that our will beat in time with his will for our life. If we're thinking about trying to go towards him, trying to walk by the Spirit, well, maybe it's lazy, but I think it's a great prayer. Just, okay, let's make this easy. So let my desires in my heart be what you want from my life.
I mean, Jesus says, in the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it said this, but I'm telling you this. He's talking about the heart, like if you even think about doing this, if you're even angry or call your brother stupid, that's coming from a heart that needs some work.
Yeah.
I want the right thing. You're right.
Yeah.
So
Daniel, I'm talking too much. Join in there.
This is great. So taking what we've been talking about here, about as a Christian, our response to sin and not letting it beat us down, remembering who we are, our identity in Christ, but yet taking sin seriously. What are maybe two healthy responses to sin that, as a Christian, if I do something like, I know that wasn't right, what are two healthy responses? And you talked about some prayers. I think that's awesome. What are maybe two unhealthy patterns, rhythms we can get into as Christians when they have fallen into some kind of sin? So a couple healthy, a couple unhealthy patterns, rhythms, that can help us.
Well, the first thing I would say would be ignoring it. And that's almost the easiest thing to do. But we can all, even if we have this conversation and we're talking about sin and it's on our radar, if we're not looking at what we're doing, if we're not recognizing the sin, if we're not being intentional to try to find the areas of our life where there needs to be a change, then it's just going to continue. And so that's a problem. So that would be number one, I think, is just ignoring it. And then number two, justifying. Well, they're doing it. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I hear something like that. It could have to do with almost anything. Well, I can do this because they're doing that. Well, what's our standard? Is it what other people are doing? Or is it the Bible? What does the Bible have to say about that? So just always need to go back to the scripture.
Ignoring, justifying. What would be a couple, if you want to repeat the prayers too, that's great. I think just hearing that again would be great. But what are a couple really healthy patterns when you know you've done something wrong that you would encourage a Christian to do?
Well, to take the chance to recognize that, and take those opportunities, be reflective about it, make changes. One thing that I have done on occasion is just pray that if there is something in my life that is not of God, that he reveal it to me. He'll let me be able to see that, because if I can't see it, I can't make changes. And he's pretty faithful with that. And a lot of times it'll be an attitude. Well, okay, so what's an attitude? When we start having thoughts, the Bible talks about taking our thoughts captive and making sure that they're pure. Jesus said, if somebody's even thought about adultery in their heart, they might as well have committed it. Why would he say something that extreme? Well, that thought becomes an attitude and then becomes an action. So those things grow. So if there's an attitude I have or a thought that I have, maybe if I'm not even realizing that it's not right, I want to identify that. And I want to cut it out, as early as possible, to try to make sure that doesn't grow into something else. So that is one thing.
And I love what you're saying there. How do you cut it out? What are rhythms or patterns that's like, I want to cut this out. So what can you do?
Well, if it's a thought or an attitude, I would say being aware and then talking back, kind of a similar type of thing to the negative self-talk that Renee and I were talking about. Talk back against it or explore it. I mean, listen to other people. Listening is loving. And so when we, like, let's say we've got a bad attitude about a group of people or a person, have a conversation, get to know them, listen to them. And that can help us understand that maybe we're not right all the time. Maybe things shouldn't always be done our way, and as Christians and as churches, those are really important lessons, especially right now. So,
and if it involves somebody else, like say, I don't know, maybe your husband, you probably should go back and try to make it right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just being sorry inside my heart seems insufficient.
Right.
I've actually done something.
Right. Actually reaching out, making that connection.
Yeah.
Is important.
Yeah.
So how important is confession?
Yeah, that is a very big topic. I mean, when you confess that you are headed the wrong direction or you've done something wrong, that's accountability. Mm-hmm. So being able to say, hey, I did this, then you have stated it, you have recognized it, it is then public in some way, even if it's just one other person, it's out there. Mm-hmm. So, and then the other person knows that that's a struggle, and then perhaps they can kind of help you out with it. You definitely want to surround yourself with people that love you, but are not impressed by you. I think that's really important. And
that's a mic drop moment right there. Just say that one more time.
Yeah. So, like, for example, my husband, we've been married 28 years, if I'm doing the math right. So, but he's my best friend, and he's definitely my ministry partner. But one of the things that I love and drives me crazy is when I'm talking about something and I'm frustrated about something, he might come back with, well, I think you have a bad attitude about that. Well, that's not what I wanted. Don't bring me back to reality. But he'll say, I think you're thinking about that wrong. And so just having people in your life that are willing to do that, that's going to keep us grounded and hopefully headed the right direction. So,
which is back to that community thing we were talking about. That's essential.
Yeah. Being able to have conversations.
I have one more question. So, we talked about the devil a bit, and I think it's safe to say, in Christian circles, we could be talking all day long about it. The devil's up to this out in the world, and he's up to this in the culture. Is the devil doing anything in our churches? We got the masquerade. I'm we'll laugh about the proverbial churches that they split over the carpet,
right? And
we'll split over more fabric issues, even today.
But it's never about the thing that they actually split over. It's never about the carpet. There is a long trend of somebody not being heard, somebody not feeling heard. And we've got to be honest. We've got to be realistic that the church is not immune to the devil's influence. And that's like humbling, and that's scary. But the big problem with the church is it's made up of people. And we're not perfect, and so he's got an entrance point, and we'll talk about the sin of pride. I mean, how many things could be like boiled down to us trying to be proud about something, get our own way. We don't want to give in. We don't want to listen. We want to assume that the way we've always done it is right, or the way we think it needs to be done is the right way. And all of those things, it can wreak havoc on a church.
And how can pride disguise itself so that it looks like, no, this is actually a really good churchy way to be?
Yeah, well, many ways. For one, could be having to look perfect. I am perfect. My family is perfect. Everything is perfect. In fact, I was having a conversation about this in my women's ministry class recently, and I was encouraging them with their own kids, like, don't try to make them look a certain way. Don't have an argument in the car on the way to church and then say, okay, everybody, you know how to act. Like, don't stress the external, stress the internal. Stress actions coming from, what's inside. But that's one thing. And boy, I tell you, when you're talking with people from outside the church that are not yet Christians, or maybe even were Christians and aren't sure they can come back, when we're trying to be prideful and look like we're perfect, they don't feel like they can fit in. I can't, there's no way to count the number of times I've heard something like that. So that's one way. And then kind of going back to that leadership piece too, where we're doing the right thing, or we are the best church in town, or we're the only right church in town, or we are the only church in town that listens to the community. That sense of pride that can feed into all kinds of things. And so those are just, I think, two major ways we can see that.
So I'm thinking, you're making me think about Ephesians, where Paul talks about, the spiritual forces. I mean, like, our battle is really not against this person across the aisle from me.
No.
There's like a spirit of pride that's maybe afflicting someone, and there's a spirit of division. And would you agree with that? That it's
Absolutely.
like, we believe, like, personally, we can be plagued by lies from Satan, but then there's forces at work, in our churches. So, it would give us grace with each other, but is there benefit in praying a particular way about that element of the problem?
Yeah, I think so. I think, well, for starters, especially if there's any hint of some kind of issue in church, praying for the other person, that's huge. I mean, that will absolutely change you if you're praying for the other person. Many people have kind of dabbled in the gratitude journals and everything. I mean, that will change the way you think. And if we pray for the person that we're not sure we can get along with, focus on our actions, our attitudes, asking God to change that, redeem that. That's going to be huge. So I think that's important. And then just also being humble, having humility.
Well, that's good. Almost like sin has a lot of power until somehow the spell is broken by humility or by praying for somebody. That's really helpful.
And it's pretty crazy, the walls that can come up. In my work with the female students, one of the things that I do see on occasion is somebody feels that distance between them and God. And it becomes a wall. They don't know how to get past it. And they can't even pray, And so sometimes just sitting there with somebody who is really feeling and struggling with a sin or with their own sinfulness, or, even if they're just angry at God and can't seem to have a conversation with him anymore, encouraging them to pray. And I try to encourage them to pray out loud. That is something that really takes some big chinks out of that wall. And once that wall starts coming down, it's a lot easier for it to come down.
This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. It's been good to be with you all.
Did you expect to get so encouraged, Daniel, talking about sin?
Well, it was very helpful practically, as well as very insightful. And that's a conversation.
Well,
I agree.
It was fun to get a chance to talk with you all this morning. So I enjoyed it myself.
Thanks, Anessa.
Thank you.